The sirens were already fading when the river gave up its secret. Dawn broke in strips of grey light over the freight yard, where rusted rails cut through weeds and the air smelled of oil and wet concrete. Police tape fluttered in the cold wind, snapping like nerves stretched too tight. Officers stood in a loose semicircle beneath the bridge, their faces set in the hollow way that comes after the shock has worn off and reality settles in. Emily Carter had been missing since midnight. Now she lay on a gurney near the water's edge, covered, the outline unmistakable. The scene was quiet except for the river moving past, indifferent, carrying away whatever traces it could. Detective Laura McKenna arrived as the medical examiner finished documenting the scene. Laura had worked homicides for 16 years, long enough to recognize the difference between chaos and choreography. This wasn't a messy crime. It was arranged. The placement beneath the bridge, the timing, the location just far enough from campus to avoid casual witnesses but close enough to suggest familiarity, it all felt intentional. Emily was 26. A graduate student in urban planning. She volunteered at a community garden, tutored on weekends, and walked everywhere. Her friends described her as careful, almost cautious. That was the detail that kept echoing in Laura's mind as she stared at the bridge overhead. Careful people didn't wander into danger by accident. The first break came before the sun had fully risen. A security guard from a nearby warehouse stepped forward, visibly shaken. He said he'd seen a man and a woman arguing near the bridge just after midnight. Voices raised. A struggle. Then a car pulling away fast enough to squeal tires on wet pavement. He gave a description. He gave a time. And he gave a name. Daniel Reed. The name moved through the scene like a current. Officers exchanged looks. Laura felt the shift immediately, the moment when a case narrows, when uncertainty starts hardening into direction. Daniel Reed lived 6 miles away. He worked at an auto shop on the east side. He had a record, old but documented, an assault charge from his early 20s, the result of a bar fight that had spiraled. And more importantly, he had history with Emily. They had dated briefly the previous year. By mid-morning, the press had already learned his name. Daniel answered the knock on his apartment door wearing grease-stained jeans and a sweatshirt pulled on too quickly. He looked confused, then pale, then terrified as officers stepped inside. He didn't resist. He kept asking the same question. What's going on? Inside the apartment, detectives found the jacket. Dark fabric, damp, with mud along the hem. It matched the security guard's description. In the parking lot, Daniel's car sat with a thin line of dirt streaked along the wheel wells, as if it had been driven hard through standing water. At the station, Daniel sat under fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched. His hands shook as he wrapped them around a paper cup of water he never drank. The detective spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the facts one by one. Emily Carter was dead. She was last seen near the river. A witness placed Daniel there. Daniel shook his head, again and again. I didn't see her, he said. I haven't talked to her in months. They asked about the jacket. He said he'd been out driving. He couldn't sleep. He'd stopped near the river to clear his head. He said the mud meant nothing. He said the timing was coincidence. Coincidence was not a word that survived long in homicide interviews. By evening, the evidence began stacking up in a way that felt impossible to ignore. Traffic cameras captured Daniel's car near the bridge just after midnight. Cell phone records showed his phone pinging off a tower in the same area. Fibers later identified as coming from Emily's scarf were found on the passenger seat. Each piece alone raised questions. Together, they told a story. And stories, Laura knew, were dangerous things. The arrest came swiftly. The mugshot hit the evening news. Emily's smiling graduation photo appeared beside it, a stark contrast that needed no commentary. The trial moved faster than anyone expected. The courtroom filled every day. Emily's parents sat in the front row, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles stayed white. Daniel sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting between the jury and the floor. The prosecution painted a clean narrative. A failed relationship. Lingering resentment. A chance encounter that turned violent. They called the security guard, who pointed to Daniel without hesitation. They introduced the forensic evidence, the phone records, the fibers. The defense tried to poke holes. They questioned the reliability of eyewitness memory. They argued contamination, coincidence, tunnel vision. But every objection seemed to dissolve under the weight of what looked like certainty. When Daniel took the stand, his voice trembled but his words never changed. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I would never hurt Emily." The prosecutor leaned in, calm and surgical. "Your car was at the scene. Your phone was at the scene. Your jacket was wet and muddy. How do you explain that?" Daniel searched the jury, desperate. "I can't," he said. "I just know I didn't do this." The verdict came back in under 4 hours. Guilty. The sentence followed weeks later. Death. As the judge read the words aloud, a sound escaped Daniel that silenced the room. It wasn't anger. It wasn't denial. It was something closer to collapse. Years passed. Appeals were filed and denied. Motions dismissed. The case became a reference point, a lesson in modern forensic prosecution. Emily Carter's name faded from headlines. Daniel Reed's became synonymous with guilt. But on death row, Daniel kept writing. Letters to journalists. To advocacy groups. To law clinics. Every letter ended the same way. "I didn't kill her. Please look again." Most were ignored. Until one wasn't. Mark Ellis was 29 and newly hired at a non-profit legal clinic. He didn't believe in miracles, and he didn't believe every claim of innocence. But he believed in procedure. In details. In the idea that certainty should always be questioned. He requested the original case file late one night, more out of curiosity than conviction. The evidence seemed airtight. That alone bothered him. As he flipped through transcripts and photographs, he noticed how quickly the investigation had focused on Daniel. How little time had been spent looking elsewhere. Then he reached the security guard's statement again. A single line caught his eye. The guard had described the man's jacket as having a distinctive tear along the right sleeve. Mark paused. The evidence photos showed Daniel's jacket clearly. There was no tear. And when Mark checked the property log, he found something else, an item listed but never introduced at trial. A second jacket, recovered from a dumpster 2 blocks from the bridge. The file ended there. No analysis. No explanation. Mark leaned back in his chair, heart pounding, staring at the line he couldn't ignore. Because if that jacket wasn't Daniel's, then someone else had been at the river that night. And the evidence everyone trusted might have been pointing in the wrong direction all along. Mark Ellis didn't sleep that night. The image of the second jacket sat in his mind like a bruise, dark, unexplained, and quietly painful. He returned to the case file at dawn, rereading every page as if the words might rearrange themselves into a different truth. The investigation had moved fast, almost aggressively so, as if everyone involved had been relieved to find a suspect who fit the story they wanted to tell. By noon, Mark was standing in the evidence storage room of the county courthouse, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A clerk retrieved the box marked Carter, Emily, miscellaneous evidence. Inside were sealed bags, yellowing paperwork, and at the bottom, the second jacket. It was similar in color to Daniel Reed's but heavier, with a rougher texture. And there it was, along the right sleeve, a clean, deliberate tear. Mark swallowed. He sent the jacket for independent forensic testing using the clinic's limited funds, knowing full well what it implied. If the results contradicted the trial evidence, it wouldn't just reopen the case. It would challenge the integrity of everyone who had touched it. While the jacket was processed, Mark turned his attention to the witness who had started it all. The security guard, Thomas Keller, had been a model witness at trial, calm, confident, unwavering. His testimony had anchored the prosecution's timeline. But reading his original statements closely, Mark noticed something odd. Keller's first description of the suspect was vague. The confidence came later, after Daniel's arrest. Memory, Mark knew, was fragile. And suggestion was powerful. He tracked Keller down to a small house on the outskirts of town. Keller answered the door slowly, his eyes wary. "I can't talk about that," Keller said immediately when Mark introduced himself. I already did my part. I'm not here to accuse you, Mark replied. I just want to understand what you saw. Keller hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the house felt cramped, the air heavy. As they talked, Keller's certainty began to fray at the edges. He admitted the night had been dark, the rain heavy. He admitted he'd been tired, distracted. And when Mark mentioned the tear in the jacket, Keller went quiet. I remember something torn, Keller said finally. That's all I know. That jacket, Mark said carefully, was never shown to the jury. Keller's face drained of color. The second forensic report arrived 2 weeks later. The jacket from the dumpster contained trace fibers that matched Emily Carter's clothing. More importantly, it carried DNA, not Daniel Reed's. It belonged to someone else. Mark brought the findings to his supervisor, who stared at the report in silence. This changes everything, she said at last. And it makes enemies. The clinic filed an emergency motion for a stay of execution and a new evidentiary hearing. The response was swift and hostile. The prosecutor's office pushed back hard, arguing contamination, chain of custody issues, anything to keep the door closed. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Mark's phone rang late at night with no one on the line. Anonymous emails warned him to stop digging. One morning, he found his car door ajar, nothing stolen, the message clear. Someone didn't want this reopened. As the court debated the motion, another unsettling discovery surfaced. A review of cell tower data, re-examined with updated technology, revealed a flaw. The tower that placed Daniel near the bridge also serviced a much wider area than originally presented. The location data wasn't precise. It never had been. The certainty cracked. Mark visited Daniel Reed on death row for the first time shortly after. Daniel looked older, thinner, his hair streaked with grey. But when Mark mentioned the jacket, something flickered in his eyes. Not hope, but recognition. I told them, Daniel said quietly. I told them someone else was there. Do you know who? Mark asked. Daniel hesitated. I had my suspicions, he said. But no one wanted to hear them. He spoke of a man Emily had mentioned shortly before her death, a volunteer at the community garden. Someone who had offered to help her late at night, someone she'd found unsettling. Daniel had brushed it off then. Now, the memory gnawed at him. Mark tracked the name down. Evan Brooks. Brooks had a history of drifting between jobs, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd volunteered at the garden briefly before disappearing from town weeks after Emily's death. His alibi had never been fully examined. At the time, there had been no need. Now, Mark needed to find him. Brooks surfaced in another state under a different last name. When investigators approached him, he panicked and ran, triggering a brief chase that ended without violence. In his possession were items that made Mark's blood run cold. Newspaper clippings about Emily Carter, saved over years. Brooks denied everything. He said he barely knew her. He said the jacket wasn't his. But the DNA didn't lie. As the hearing date approached, the atmosphere around the case turned volatile. The prosecution accused the clinic of manufacturing doubt. The media resurrected the story, this time with a different tone. Was the wrong man sentenced to die? Emily's family was caught in the middle, forced to confront the possibility that the man they believed responsible might not be the killer after all. Then, days before the hearing, a fire broke out in the courthouse records room. Sprinklers extinguished the flames quickly, but several boxes of archived evidence were damaged, including materials related to the Carter case. Officials called it an accident. Mark wasn't convinced. When the evidentiary hearing finally began, the courtroom was packed again, but the energy was different. Uneasy. Tense. Mark presented the second jacket, the DNA results, the revised cell data. He called Keller, who admitted under oath that his identification might have been influenced. The judge listened, expression unreadable. Then the prosecution stood. They revealed something no one expected, a previously undisclosed confession. Evan Brooks, they said, had confessed to being at the bridge that night, but claimed he arrived after Emily was already dead. The courtroom erupted. If Brooks had been there, and Daniel had been there, and the timeline no longer held, then the case was no longer a straight line. It was a maze. And somewhere inside it was the truth. As the judge called for order, Mark felt the weight of what was coming. Because proving Daniel's innocence now meant unraveling not just a crime, but a system that had already decided how the story ended. And systems, once threatened, rarely went down quietly. The courtroom felt smaller than it had years earlier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Daniel Reed sat at the defense table once more, his wrists cuffed, his shoulders rigid. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times on death row, imagined freedom, imagined vindication, but reality was colder, heavier. Nothing had been decided yet. Everything could still be taken away. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the packed room. Reporters lined the back wall. Emily Carter's parents sat together again, older now, grief carved deeper into their faces. They had come seeking clarity, but clarity had become the most elusive thing of all. Mark Ellis stood when called, heart pounding, and laid out the final pieces of a case that had once seemed unbreakable. He walked the court through the jacket found in the dumpster. The tear that matched the original witness description. The DNA that excluded Daniel Reed entirely. The fibers that placed the jacket in direct contact with Emily. He moved on to the cell phone data. How it had been overstated. How the technology at the time could not have placed Daniel at the bridge with certainty. How the prosecution's timeline relied on assumptions that no longer held. Then came Evan Brooks. Brooks sat in the witness box with his hands clasped, eyes darting between the judge and the floor. His earlier confession had been partial, carefully worded. Mark pushed past it. "You admitted being at the bridge that night," Mark said. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Brooks swallowed. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being blamed." The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed it. Mark's voice sharpened. "You volunteered with Emily. You knew her routines. You knew she walked home late. And after her death, you left town." Brooks shook his head. "I didn't kill her." "But you were there," Mark said. "And your jacket was found with her fibers and your DNA." The silence that followed was suffocating. The prosecution's rebuttal was fierce. They argued that Brooks's presence didn't absolve Daniel. That multiple people could be involved. That the original evidence still painted Daniel as the central figure. But the certainty was gone. When the judge finally ruled, the words landed like a controlled explosion. Daniel Reed's conviction was vacated. Gasps rippled through the room. Emily's mother covered her mouth. Daniel closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face before he could stop them. The death sentence was lifted. Daniel was led out not to freedom, but back to holding, this time as a man awaiting a new trial, not an execution. The media called it a victory. A triumph of justice. Mark Ellis was praised, interviewed, quoted. But the truth refused to settle. Weeks turned into months. The state prepared to retry the case, this time with Brooks as a suspect. But the momentum slowed. Evidence had been compromised. Witnesses recanted or hedged. The fire at the courthouse had destroyed more than paperwork, it had erased possibilities. Then Evan Brooks disappeared. His apartment was found empty, his phone abandoned, his car parked at a bus terminal with no cameras pointing in the right direction. The man who might have answered everything was gone. Without him, the prosecution's case collapsed entirely. The charges against Daniel Reed were dismissed. After 14 years, Daniel walked out of prison a free man. Cameras flashed as he stepped into daylight, blinking like someone emerging from a cave. Mark stood nearby, unsure whether to smile or mourn. Freedom didn't erase the years stolen. It didn't give Daniel back the life he'd lost. "I'm grateful," Daniel said quietly to the reporters. "But I still want the truth." Emily Carter's family watched from a distance. They had lost their daughter. Then they had lost the certainty of who was responsible. Closure, it turned out, was not guaranteed by the system. Time moved on. Daniel tried to rebuild. He found work. He stayed out of the spotlight. At night, he still woke up reaching for walls that weren't there. He wrote less, but when he did, the words were different now, less desperate, more searching. Mark Ellis continued his work, though the case followed him like a shadow. He knew they had corrected a terrible wrong. He also knew they might never know what truly happened under that bridge. Then, 3 months after Daniel's release, a body was found. Another woman. Different city. Different river. Same careful placement beneath a bridge. The same deliberate stillness. The details trickled in slowly, painfully familiar. The victim had volunteered. She walked late. She trusted easily. Witnesses reported a man nearby, offering help, then disappearing into the night. Mark saw the headline early one morning and felt his stomach drop. He drove to the police station without calling ahead. The lead detective on the new case didn't want to talk at first. Then Mark mentioned Evan Brooks. The detective's expression changed. "We've been looking for him," she said. "Do you know where he is?" "No," Mark replied. "But I think I know what he's done." Days later, Brooks was arrested crossing the border, his face captured on a grainy security camera. In his backpack, investigators found a folded jacket. Torn at the sleeve. Under interrogation, Brooks finally broke. He confessed, not just to Emily Carter's murder, but to another attempt years earlier that had gone unnoticed. He spoke of control, of opportunity, of knowing where no one would look too closely once a convenient suspect appeared. When asked why he let Daniel take the fall, Brooks laughed bitterly. "Because he was already guilty of something," Brooks said. "People like that always are." The confession closed the circle, but it didn't heal it. Emily Carter's family attended the sentencing in silence. Brooks received life without parole. No death sentence. No spectacle. Just a quiet ending to a long trail of damage. Daniel Reed was not there. He watched the news from his small apartment, hands clenched, breathing slow. He felt no triumph. Only a hollow understanding of how close he'd come to disappearing forever. Later that night, he wrote one final letter. Not to a court. Not to a journalist. To himself. The system had nearly killed an innocent man because the evidence had looked right, because the story had been easy, because no one had wanted to search for something uglier beneath the surface. And somewhere, in a file drawer or a burned box of records, there were other cases like his. Other names. Other truths waiting to be questioned. The story ended where it began, with certainty undone. And if you think this case was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Stay close. The truth doesn't like to stay buried.